Good morning, Phillippe Legrain. Thank you for taking time out. I know you're a busy chap. We met just recently, a few weeks ago, where you presented was really fascinating insight into business, and in particular into minority businesses. And your report was called Minority Businesses Matter. So just before we kick into the report, which I really did find extremely fascinating, a bit about you then. You're an acknowledged expert on immigration and diversity. You're a senior visiting fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. You're the founder of the Open Political Economy Network, international think tank. You're a media commentator, including BBC World. You've been previously economic advisor to the head of the team providing strategic advice to the President of the European Commission and the Director General of the WTO. And you're an economist at one of my favorite magazines, The Economist. You're the journalist there. So great. Listen, thanks very much, Phillippe. So if I can go straight in, there's two schools of thought, which is business. It's irrelevant what the person who heads it looks like. But you've chosen to pick minority businesses as something that is worth looking at, and it's interesting as somebody who's a British Sikh. It was really fascinating. So first question really is, what is a minority business?
Well, just to start off, I mean, the idea for this report came from an organization called MSDUK, which is a membership organization that connects ethnic minority businesses to larger corporates and helps them to get more contracts from those corporates. So they came to us with the idea for the report, and obviously with my background in research on immigration and indeed immigrant entrepreneurship, it seemed like a perfect fit. And yet, even with all that specialist knowledge that I had, I was taken aback at how significant, it turns out, the contribution of minority businesses is to the UK and indeed to society in all sorts of ways, from combating coronavirus to creating new technologies. Now, how do to answer your question, how do you define minority businesses? Well, they include various types. One is minority sole traders. The second is businesses in which people from an ethnic minority own at least half of the shares. Thirdly, they are businesses in which people from ethnic minorities account for at least half of the founders. So, for example, if you look at a company like Bulb Energy, which is a renewable electricity supplier, one of the two founders, Amit Gupta, is from an ethnic minority, so therefore we classify it as such. And then last but not least, they are listed companies whose shares trade on the stock exchange. But at the time of their listing, they were owned or controlled by people from ethnic minorities, and the person and they are still run by someone from ethnic minorities. So an example of that is B&M. It's a discount retailer. When it was listed on the stock market in 2014, Simon Aurora and his brothers were the owners of it. Now that its shares have been opened up to the wider public, they no longer own more than half the shares. They're still the largest shareholders, and Simon Aurora remains the CEO. And therefore, it makes sense to continue to classify it as an ethnic minority business.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good place to start. So, in putting the report together, why do we need to understand the importance of ethnic minority business? And I say that because you're an expert on immigration, and I remember the furor around the Brexit vote and how the Turkish element was brought in, how immigration was bad. So is this part of the perception thing, which is to sort of say, well, that's not really the perception. The perception is that actually in reality, this is what minority businesses do, or is it their contribution? So why do we need to understand the importance of ethnic minority businesses?
I think you can look at it in several ways. I mean, the first is to say, obviously, that minority businesses are first and foremost businesses. They produce valuable goods and services, they create jobs, they pay taxes, they create wealth. And in that respect, they're just the same as a business that is owned by someone who is not from an ethnic minority business, ethnic minority. At the same time, I think it's very important, given, as you said, the prejudices that often exist about immigrants in general and people from minorities in particular, to make clear that even though they often face huge challenges, not least discrimination, that actually, against the odds, they make an outsized contribution to the UK. So we used a company called Guyana, which is a minority a data science company, and they used AI tools to go through the entire company's house database and using an algorithm to identify owners that were likely to be from an ethnic minority. And then we cross-checked the results to see whether they were accurate or not. And on that basis, we found that actually there are many more ethnic minority businesses than we thought. There are around 1 million of the 6 million businesses in the UK, that they create 3 million jobs, which is significant considering the total workforce in the UK is something 31 million or something like that. And that they create value of £74 billion a year. And previous estimates, which were based on a flawed and incomplete survey of smaller businesses, suggested it was only 25 billion, which was a huge underestimate. And actually, our figures suggest it's 3 times as high as 74 billion, and that's a really significant contribution. So it matters, of course, in terms of in terms of the interest that there's going to be in these businesses, for example, in policy circles. At the launch of our report, we were privileged to have Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, who himself is obviously the son of Ghanaian immigrants, speaking at the launch. And if the interests and the issues of minority businesses are to get a hearing in Whitehall, or indeed at a regional level, where I know you're involved, it's important that that policymakers be aware of the contribution that they already make, so that they can better address the problems that they face and make the most of their huge potential, which is important not just for the businesses themselves, but for Britain as a whole, at a time when we're trying to build back better from the coronavirus, and we're going to need all the entrepreneurial ingenuity of everyone in Britain. Minority businesses can make a huge contribution.
A couple of things that struck me. One was the corporation tax they pay, and corporation tax has been in the budget, big news. So minority businesses will be contributing towards that corporation tax. I was amazed by the number of employees, as you mentioned earlier, and of course the pre-tax profits. But let me ask you, does your research and general understanding of immigration and business, does it chime with the notion that's always been propagated that immigrants generally are more entrepreneurial than the indigenous population because of the circumstances? Is that what you found? Does that sort of correlate?
Sure. I mean, I just published a new book called Them and Us, How Immigrants and Locals Can Thrive Together, which came out in October last year. And that's a global book, not just looking at the UK. And the evidence globally is that immigrants tend to be much more entrepreneurial than locals, and that's most obvious in the tech sector, where you can see that, for example, nearly half of the startups in Silicon Valley are co-founded by migrants, but it's also true across the economy as a whole. So you look, for example, in Germany, where it's notoriously hard to start a business and where immigrants face perhaps bigger challenges than most. You saw that 42% of businesses are started by immigrants, and that they're several times more likely to start a business than people born in Germany. And that's a really significant contribution. And one study here in the UK, for example, found that half of the fastest growing businesses in the UK, and they're the businesses which are, creating a disproportionate amount of jobs. They're involved in exciting sectors, and the fastest growing actually is Bulb Energy, which I've already mentioned. That half of those were co-founded by immigrants.
That was also very interesting. We talked about understanding their importance. We've already spoken about how they can help the UK recover through collection of taxes. But what I found really interesting is the government is looking at levelling up. And yet most of these businesses are set up outside of London and in probably the most deprived areas. So they're actually employing people in areas which are deemed not to be functioning as well as other parts. So almost they're assisting the government in their levelling up agenda, really.
Sure. I mean, obviously, the levelling up agenda is primarily an issue for government. It requires, public investment, and changes in regulations to make it to foster development in deprived areas outside London. At the same time, the private sector has an important role to play, and minority businesses in particular. And as you rightly say, we compiled the first ever list of the top 100 minority businesses in the UK, the top 100 businesses by turnover. And many of them are located in London, unsurprisingly, given the high minority population here. At the same time, if you look at the largest minority businesses in the UK, they are in the north of England. There is Asda, which is in Leeds. There is the EG Group in Blackburn, and there is a B&M in Liverpool. And then if you look at minority businesses in that top 100, which are located outside London, 21 of the 39 in England are in deprived areas, and so is 3 of the 4 in Scotland and 1 of the 2 in Wales. And so you can see that they are, through their activities, helping in some of the most deprived areas of the country. We took another way of looking at it. We looked at the location of B&M discount stores, and we looked at around the country. In the report, we have a map of where they're located in Manchester and in Birmingham, and you can see that they tend to be located in more deprived areas. And so that provides 2 benefits. Obviously, it provides a benefit to local shoppers because they can benefit from the low prices that tend to be in B&M stores, and it provides a benefit in terms of jobs because B&M tends to employ lots of people, and indeed it continues to open new stores. So that's a very powerful illustration about how minority businesses can help with the levelling up agenda.
I remember when I set up my business a long time ago, ethnic minority businesses generally tended to be in manufacturing, and then of course China came along and Bangladesh came along, so they sort of morphed into retail. But of course that's no longer the case now. You've already made a reference to Bulb, but we got, and of course what's interesting about Bulb is that in the environmental green sector, which is again what government's looking for, but they're also in fintech, and in the report we mentioned about unicorns. So is that right? Of ethnic minority businesses now moved, and do they resemble more of what the indigenous population business profile looks like? Are they now similar to that?
Well, I mean, you talk about the stereotypical minority business several decades ago would either have been a convenience store or an Indian restaurant. And it's still true that roughly 1 in 3 independent convenience stores in Britain are run by entrepreneurs of Asian ethnicity. And it's true that there are roughly 12,000 Indian restaurants, mostly Bangladeshi run, and that they are the largest group of restaurants in the UK. So those stereotypical kind of businesses, which are important, still exist. At the same time, minority businesses are ever more diverse, and they operate across the economy. And you mentioned in tech, well, 8 of the 23 tech unicorns. Unicorns are startups valued at more than $1 billion, which is roughly 740 million pounds. 8 of those 23 extremely valuable tech companies were co-founded by minority entrepreneurs. And the most valuable of all is Deliveroo, which obviously has kept many of us fed during these interminable lockdowns, and which is looking to be listed on the stock market in London at a valuation of $10 billion. So it's absolutely huge. Or you're looking at Oxford Nanopore, which is a biotech company, and that has not just developed tests for testing the genome of the coronavirus, which obviously is helping in the response against it, but also low cost and rapid tests for coronavirus infection itself. Or indeed Hopin, which is a virtual events platform, and at a time when virtual conferences and events offline have been impossible, increasingly they're taking place online, and Hopin is the #1 global company in that space, enabling increasingly events to take place virtually. So yes, technology is another one. Finance is another. You can see the FT does a list of the fastest growing companies across Europe. The #1 in that FT 1000 is Oak North Bank, which is co-founded by a British Indian founder, and it specializes in providing finance to small and medium-sized businesses that often struggle to receive adequate funding from high street lenders. So it's playing a very important role. But you can see it, our report is actually, extremely complete. It's got 144 pages. A lot of that consists of interviews with entrepreneurs such as yourself. Obviously, you have a full-page picture in it. You feature prominently in it. And across the whole span of the economy, you can see minority businesses doing innovative and exciting things. Everything from food to tech to finance to media and to manufacturing.
I also remember the 90s when, in my neck of the woods, the Black Country, the foundries started to get shut down, manufacturing started to disappear, and we had a generation of what we call, I don't know if the word is right, reluctant entrepreneurs, business people who then set up because they realized there was no future for them. Others faced discrimination within the workplace and thought, well, I'll only root out. And some of them actually couldn't even get a job. So it was just, so they set about, business. That was probably the only way. So they had a number of strengths really going for them. And your report, you sort of mentioned determination, drive, diversity. Perhaps you can elaborate on whether that's still the case and what seems to be the prompt for ethnic minority people of that origin to go into business. Has that changed, or has something else come up that, because they're much more educated than perhaps their forefathers?
Well, obviously, minority entrepreneurs are very diverse, and they come from all sorts of backgrounds, and some of them have PhDs, and some of them left school. Some of them were born in the UK, some of them were born abroad, and they're all across the country doing all sorts of different kinds of businesses, from your local nail salon up to multi-billion multinationals. So they're extremely diverse. But based on our own research and the interviews with entrepreneurs, we found that minority entrepreneurs tended to encounter 3 types of challenges. One, quite unsurprisingly, is discrimination. A second is a disconnection from mainstream business networks. And a third is doubt, or a lack of self-confidence. And clearly discrimination can be a big driver to start a business if you feel that you lack opportunities in the job market, either that you can't find a job or that you're not progressing in your career because of that. Many of the entrepreneurs that we spoke to said, well, I got fed up of this and I decided to start out on my own. And like that, my success or failure was due to my own efforts rather than due to, bosses who were discriminating against me or not valuing me properly. And so, in a sense, those particular challenges that minority entrepreneurs face can be connected to the strengths that they bring as entrepreneurs. The first is like a burning drive to succeed. Second is a determination to overcome obstacles, kind of resilience. Whatever life and business throws at you, you just keep on going. And last but not least, having a diversity of skills and experience and perspectives, whether that is knowledge of a foreign market, which means that you're able to sell to that market, whether it is the fact that what people from your ethnicity in the local community want and you can sell to them, whether it is just simply spotting opportunities and seeing things differently. So, for example, if you look at the most successful minority entrepreneurs in the country, Mohsin and Zubair Issa, their parents migrated from India. They grew up in a petrol station which their parents ran, and they started off working in a petrol station themselves. And they realized that basically petrol stations were poorly exploited retail opportunities. At the time, basically, in the shops that they had in a petrol station, you might be able to buy, oil or, a set of windscreen wipers, but you couldn't pretty much buy anything else. And they thought, actually, this is a really missed opportunity. And so they managed to scrabble money together, buy their first petrol station, and developed, put a shop there. And what is now taken for granted, the fact that there are retail forecourts in petrol stations, not just on the sides of motorways, but indeed in city centres. They were the pioneers in that area. They spotted an opportunity that the big boys, the BPs and the Shells didn't spot. And as a result, they've been incredibly successful and they've transformed Britain. And that's a classic example of how the diversity of perspectives can help drive business success. And they've been so successful indeed that they've now bought Asda, the supermarket chain. So they now own the first and the second biggest minority businesses in the UK.
It was interesting when you talked about in your research the number of reasons why people chose to become an entrepreneur or self-employed, and it sort of says, particularly if they were caught in mid-career. So does that make ethnic minority the community a lot more risk takers? Do they have a propensity to take risks? And following your case study you just gave now, does that make them then by nature a lot more innovative? And again, picking your earlier point up about going into green technology, going into just tech itself. So are they, ostensibly more risk taking and therefore by nature they're more innovative?
Well, I mean, there's a question about whether there's a causality question, which is to what extent are minority entrepreneurs more willing to take risks, and to what extent are they forced to take more risks due to the lack of opportunities in safer conventional careers? And I think it can be a bit of both. I think certainly many of the entrepreneurs we spoke to, for example, the most successful community of minority entrepreneurs in this country are the East African Asians who arrived as refugees in the early 70s. And many of them said, having gone through the experience of the refugee experience of losing everything, being forced to move to another country, that nothing really scares you anymore. if you've survived that, then you can survive whatever business throws at you. And at the same time, you are often desperate to try and restore what you had before, and that makes you extremely hard working and willing to go the extra mile to try and succeed. So I think that's clearly a factor. At the same time, you'll see that some minority entrepreneurs would prefer the safety and security of conventional employment, but they just didn't find those opportunities. And certainly, so you'll see, many of the minority entrepreneurs who initially will have set up convenience stores and so on, they couldn't find opportunities elsewhere, and they ended up starting small businesses because that was the only way to earn a living and get ahead. And in that respect, were they risk taking, or were they simply forced to take risks? I think it's probably a bit of both.
You mentioned that they have a diversity of skills, a diversity of perspectives. Is that what makes them therefore a lot more, a lot more aligned to going international, because they have that wide lens? So there's two great examples in the report of Poonam Gupta and Rami Ranger. I mean, Poonam Gupta was 55 million, of which virtually all of it was export. Does that give them a propensity to become a lot more outward looking and a lot more embracing of different cultures, and therefore they don't see the barriers internationally?
Well, I think Poonam Gupta is a very interesting example. I mean, she arrived as an immigrant from India, and she spotted the opportunities that existed, which is that, the West was wasting so much paper, and that there was a market for recycled paper in India. And therefore, she used her knowledge of both markets to create a business. And then having that knowledge of two markets then made it much easier to export to other countries, because you already have a set of skills for navigating two markets, and it's just a question of tailoring it a bit more to acquiring the knowledge of a third market. So I think that's a really interesting example. Rami Ranger was, like you said, was another one. That was earlier, where he spotted the opportunities in selling British products to underserved Commonwealth markets, where there were there was brand recognition of British products and a desire to have them. At the same time, the larger UK companies were neglecting them because they felt the countries were too poor and not worth focusing on. And so he started off first in shipping or exporting British products, and then in producing his own versions of them, own label, and therefore, instead of selling McVitie's biscuits, he would sell his own label version of McVitie's biscuits with the agreement of McVitie's, for example. And as a result, as he put it, he got two bites of the cherry. He got money from shipping the products, and then he got money also from selling those products. And that is a classic example of having knowledge of both the UK market and foreign markets enables you to create businesses that local entrepreneurs wouldn't. And if you want to look, the top 100 businesses in minority businesses that we identified, they export 18.5 billion pounds a year alone. And that is more than British exports to Japan. It's more than British exports to Australia or Canada. So it's a very significant figure. And that's just the top 100 alone.
That's a powerful number of stats there. But going back to the challenges, you talk about doubt, you talk about finance, and in your, maybe got the numbers wrong, I don't think I have, but at the top 192 Asian businesses, but you only could identify one black business. What's the issue there? Is there a particular problem? that type of business? I was trying to get my head around why there's such a disparity between those sort of different backgrounds.
I think you're absolutely right to say that we found in our top 100 that the vast majority of that top 100 were owned by people of Indian ethnicity, and disproportionately actually from of East African origin. And that only one of them was owned by a black person, which is World Remit, which is an international payments processor, which was founded by a refugee from Somalia called Ismail Ahmed. And the question is, why do we spot that pattern? Well, if you look at the data, you find that black people actually are much more entrepreneurial than people, not just than white people, but the people of other ethnicities. They're 3 times more likely to be starting a business than white people. And then you look at newly started businesses and you see that they are slightly more likely to have a newly started business than white people. But then you look at established businesses, ones that have been around for at least 3.5 years, and you see that they're much less likely. So something is happening, which means that many promising businesses are either failing to get started or failing quickly for some reason. Now, we don't pretend to have a definitive answer to a hugely complex issue such as this. We've based, in the report though, we look at the existing evidence and we interviewed entrepreneurs and experts to try and get their take. And I think a part of the issue obviously is that black people face particularly severe problems with discrimination and entrenched deprivation. But I think one of the explanations for the pattern that we observe of high business formation, but few businesses surviving, many of the entrepreneurs we spoke to said that Asian entrepreneurs tended to enjoy much more family and community support than black entrepreneurs often did. And many of the experts we spoke to said that in particular, black-owned businesses suffered problems with access to finance, and therefore that made them very fragile, and that they didn't have the funds to grow, and if they ran into trouble, they didn't have the funds to survive. I think that's clearly, I think those are clearly two significant issues.
So moving on from that, there was the report was fascinating in another respect, and it came up with a series of really insightful recommendations. So what needs to change? What can we do to make the most of the huge potential? And you've just identified a couple of issues already to make the most of the huge potential of minority businesses. And incidentally, I don't know if you can in your answer, if you could compare how other countries have or haven't managed to, grow their ethnic minority businesses potential. So yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I don't know if you'll have a bash at what we could do to sort of. I know you've given me some brilliant examples of some great success, but I get the impression, particularly as you said recently, there's a lot of untapped potential that perhaps we could do something with. So, well, what did you have in mind?
I think you're absolutely right to say that. I mean, it is remarkable, given the huge challenges that minority entrepreneurs tend to face, how many are successful and how big a contribution they make. But one shouldn't leap from that to think that everything is okay, because actually the ones who do succeed tend to succeed against the odds. Many minority businesses fail to grow or fail altogether because they face challenges. And that's not just a personal tragedy, it's a missed opportunity for Britain as a whole, because these are promising entrepreneurs who, with the right help and support, could be building viable businesses that create many more jobs. So we look at how we could address the three particular challenges that we've identified of discrimination, of disconnection from mainstream business networks, and doubt. And in terms of addressing discrimination, obviously, as the Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted, addressing issues of racism and discrimination across society is a huge task. It's a hugely complex task, and we don't propose or purport in our report to identify everything that needs to be done. We focus very specifically on business-specific issues that could help minority entrepreneurs. And one big one is encouraging larger businesses to buy more from smaller minority businesses. Now, small businesses in general often face difficulties in selling to larger businesses, and minority ones do in particular. And it's the case for supply diversity is a bit like the case for workforce diversity, which is, you'll find that employers tend to employ people who look like themselves, who come from similar backgrounds, and that feels nice and safe and comfortable. And the guy doing the recruiting went to Oxford, and he recruits a guy who also went to Oxford, and they tend to get on well, and they think actually it's a good fit, and that's and that's all fine. And actually, that's not just unfair because you're discriminating against people who aren't white males from. It's also bad business because you're missing out on the diverse talents of females from minorities who might have been to a different university and might have different perspectives that contribute a lot to the team. And likewise, the huge benefits and contributions that we've identified that minority businesses create, if those larger corporates are to benefit from those, they need to change their procurement practices to not simply always buy from the traditional suppliers that they've always worked with, and to branch out and to look at the opportunities from buying from minority businesses. And that can help them to cut costs. It can help them to build more resilient supply chains. It can help them benefit from the innovative products that are supplied by minority entrepreneurs. And so we think that FTSE 100, the largest companies in the country, ought to take a lead in this, that as they already do, foreign multinationals have an important role to play, and that government as a whole does too, whether it is at central government level or indeed at local level, in terms of its massive procurement from business, that it ought to be sourcing much more widely from smaller minority businesses. And we think that that would make a big impact in terms of overcoming the discrimination that minority businesses tend to face.
How would you argue against the charge that you're distorting the market?
It's not a question of distorting the market. It's a question of it's in the interests of larger businesses themselves, and that comes back to the analogy I gave you about the recruitment. Larger businesses, the procurement managers are used to dealing with the same people. They've always had the long-standing relationship. They go down the pub with. They know each other well, and so on. And so they think that the existing relationships that they have are the best possible ones because it feels it's always worked like that. You know the person, you trust the person, and so on. But actually, those larger businesses are missing out on those opportunities. Now, if you take the example of the US, and you asked for foreign examples, in the US, government bodies are mandated to purchase from minority businesses. They're required to do so, and that has led to massive growth for minority businesses. In the UK, there are no such requirements, and our report is not making those, not suggesting that there should be. So we're not thinking of meddling in the market in that sense, but we do think that government and larger businesses can set the lead, and that they will have benefits from doing so, not just in having a more cost competitive and resilient and diverse supply chain, but also in terms of CSR and other benefits, because they'll be seen to trying to source from minority businesses, and therefore helping out those entrepreneurs. And ultimately, it will be a win-win for them. But often, because of that lack of awareness and because of those lack of relationships, you need to give things a push.
I thought the mentoring of large ethnic minority business for smaller ones, I think is brilliant. And I think that's brilliant because the larger ones will know what it's like to have been when they were small. So I think that's a really good one. You mentioned, unless I read it wrong, company's house, maybe something around the ethnicity, and how would that help?
Well, just to come back to what you said, I think it's really important in addressing doubt that that minority entrepreneurs who are increasingly can be role models, and hopefully our report can help increase the visibility of minority entrepreneurs, and that in turn will help those who are starting out now, who are still at school, who want to start out, to say, look, this is something that I can do with my life. Because one of the issues we encountered is kind of a poverty of expectations, often in schools, from careers advisors and teachers who don't think that young people from minority backgrounds can succeed, and who give them bad suggestions. And therefore, not just as role models, but also as mentors, I think it's increasingly incumbent on minority entrepreneurs who have been successful to help nurture the next generation. So I think you're absolutely right to be highlighting that. You also pointed to the lack of data. Companies House, which is the registrar of UK businesses, requires anyone who is a corporate officer, that means whether they're a company director or indeed a person of significant control, to provide a host of information about themselves. You need to give your address, you need to give your citizenship, and so on. What you don't need to give is either your country of birth or indeed your ethnicity. And that means that we lack data about minority businesses. And that's a problem about whether you're trying to assess their contribution, whether you're trying to assess their particular needs and interests, whether you're trying to map where they are across the country, and so on. Now, we've used a shortcut around this using these AI tools, but it would be hugely advantageous for study of minority businesses, for policymakers to require that this information be provided, because the existing data that we have from survey evidence is woefully incomplete, and much more research is needed in this area.
I have to concur with you. I tell you what, it was a real problem. When COVID was at its most virulent, and it was identified that people of BAME origin were at most risk, local and national government knew that, as you said earlier, people tend to employ people that look like them. And because they couldn't identify the business owners, so example, if it was an Indian, the likelihood is they'll probably have Indian employees. Because that lack of data, they didn't know where these people were. And they couldn't get NHS out to explain at the workplace, because they just didn't know where these people were. So you're absolutely right, not just at the national level, but at the local, regional level. If we're going to maximize on all this potential, then you can't do without data. So I'm completely with you there. You talked about specific funds, and just a couple of points before we wrap up. I think in the report you said there should be a fund put aside because you've identified funding as a key problem. Again, somebody might argue, well, yeah, put a fund aside for ethnic minority businesses, but surely they're no different to the indigenous population, a small SME or a micro, who also would struggle to get funding. So again, are you sort of making a special case here?
Well, I mean, there was a very successful fund for women-owned businesses called the Aspire Fund, which particularly targeted their needs. And we're arguing that a similar fund ought to be created for minority businesses and indeed for Black-owned businesses in particular. Now, that is not to say that other businesses, other small businesses don't have needs too. It's really to say that minority businesses face particular challenges, just as female-owned ones do, and therefore a particular fund targeting them can be of great benefit. I think that more generally, whether it is the new infrastructure bank that's being created, or whether it is the British Business Bank, which ought to play a bigger role in trying to fund the recovery from COVID, that much more funding ought to be going to businesses in general. And all we're saying is that as part of greater investment in businesses in general and greater investment in Britain as a whole, since it's those businesses which are going to create the jobs and pay the wages, that there ought to be some of it going to minority businesses. It's not at the exclusion of others. It's an addition to others.
I think just as an observation for myself, the reason why I love the mentoring thing we spoke about earlier is we tend to find small businesses, irrespective of their background, struggle with finance because the business planning process hasn't been thought through. So they haven't got a cogent business plan, which is what tends to lead to rejection. And that's why I love the mentoring thing, because people can be mentored into putting a proposal together that's a lot more attractive, a lot more thought out, and would attract funds. But I think you gave me a great example of a fund that has worked. So final couple of points. You mentioned in the recommendation around networking, and again, you made the point earlier on that particularly in the Asian community, they seem to know the connections, they have the network to go to. How would you rectify that then? I mean, the numbers with other trade organizations, membership organizations, are woeful. I mean, I know I've been a past president of the Black Country Chamber of Commerce, and I sit on the CBI Small Business Committee, and generally speaking, I tend to be the only non-white face in the room. So,
well, I think
where's the problem?
I think you need to distinguish between two types of networks. I think on the basis of our research, we find that Asian entrepreneurs tend to have strong ethnic networks. So they have both family and community willing to help out, whether it is in terms of providing patient initial capital, whether it is in providing an initial market, or whether it is in help in all sorts of other ways. And that is a strength relative to, on average, Black-owned businesses, where that family and community support is often lacking. But even while those Asian businesses often enjoy that strong family and ethnic network, they still tend to be disconnected from mainstream business networks.
Yeah.
Now, that is changing. I mean, you can see now that the president of the CBI is Karen Villamarillo, who is the founder of Cobra Beer. You can see that the likes of the Federation of Small Businesses is doing more to try and help and represent the interests of minority businesses. And yet the entrepreneurs we've spoken to said that they don't feel represented by those networks as much as they should. They've said to us that they often struggle to find information, advice, contacts access to finance and so on. Clearly, there's a role therefore for organisations such as MSDUK that help to connect minority businesses to larger ones. And clearly there's a role for government in making a greater effort to listen to the interests and views of minority entrepreneurs, and ensuring that those interests and views are reflected more in government policy, whether that is in terms of funding or regulation or whatever.
Final question, fascinating insights. Final question, we've had the roadmap given to us by the PM. There's been wide acknowledgement of key workers, frontline workers, and there hasn't been much noise about how Asian businesses or ethnic minority businesses as a whole have responded to the COVID-19 crisis. Perhaps you could give us an insight, because you've been tracking what's been happening over the last 12 months. And before we conclude, so how have minority businesses assisted or responded to COVID-19 crisis?
Right, I mean, minority businesses played a really important role, whether it is Oxford Nanopore, as I already mentioned, which is sequencing COVID genomes and providing low-cost, rapid COVID tests, whether it is the likes of Brock's Compass, which supplies PPE, the personal protective equipment that keeps people safe, whether it is minority-owned care homes. HC1 is the biggest care home owner in the UK, and it's minority-owned, and clearly some care homes have had problems, but overall they've played a big role in keeping elderly, vulnerable people safe. Whether it is Deliveroo, as I already mentioned, delivering meals and supplies, or Babylon Health, which is another unicorn, which helps provide online GP consultations, which were previously rare and has now become very common during the pandemic, and in all sorts of other ways. Minority businesses have played a really significant and unsung role in helping to combat what is not just the biggest business crisis since the Second World War, but arguably the biggest societal crisis since the Second World War. And I think that role needs to be recognised.
Finally, thank you very much for your time. It's been incredibly insightful. So if people want to get hold of the report or want to contact you, particularly with your book that you spoke about, immigration and economics and business, how can they get hold of both the report and your book? Is it to contact you directly, or? Well,
hopefully you'll put a link on.
I will.
when you can disseminate it on social media, but otherwise on our website is opennetwork.net, and on Twitter it's open_progress. I am Phillippe Legrain, and my Twitter handle is plegrain. And you can email me at philippe@opennetwork.net. That's PHILIPPE @opennetwork.net.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fascinating. It'll be an interesting place to revisit maybe again, and I'm more than happy to bring you in to have a look at what's transpired in a post-COVID environment, in a post-Brexit environment, and whether actually the way ethnic minority businesses are now operating and employing, whether actually they're the secret weapon for levelling up. But thank you very much, Phillippe, and look forward to speaking to you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ninder. It was great. Thank you.